Okay, in this presentation, I'm going to go over some of the problems that I saw on your midterm responses. I tried to grade as nicely as I could. So I kind of graded on a curve. So I kind of said, what is the best response, and then tried to keep everything within that category. So most of you got somewhere between an A minus and a C. Um, a C would reflect kind of an answer that doesn't quite talk about the materials in class, or if you didn't answer all of the questions. Um, a B would be kind of like you're starting to get there, but you're not making the connections. And then an A minus would be, you're almost there. You were starting to make the connections, but you just didn't quite explain it as well as you need to. So, the first thing that you all need to do is you need to get past blame and the intent of wrong. I know this is probably a hard thing for most of you to do as you're entering into the college environment, online. Um, in your day to day experiences, you probably tend to look for the intent of others, right? So if somebody cuts you off, you want to attribute something that's wrong with them. If somebody says something about you that you don't like, then you want to blame them again for something being wrong with them. Um, of course, that's fine in your everyday life. I'm not here to judge your morals, um, but that's not social science. And that's what you're learning in this class is what's the difference between objective reasoning and this kind of transference that you're doing. You're taking your subjectivity and generalizing it to other people. So somebody might say something like, you don't learn this way, right? Um, it might be true that like the individual doesn't learn a particular way, but that's not true that all people don't learn uh, a certain way, right? Say memorization or something. So I want to try to help you get past that. But first, let's talk about what's the point of having a midterm exam, in general. Um, so basically, like I've given you materials and I've given you things to think about, and these are to challenge your pre-existing beliefs. Now, I'm going to assume that you watched the videos, that you did the readings, that you looked at the maps, that you thought about these things. It would be nice if you talked about these things with other people, since we don't have that classroom experience. So in the last 2 semesters that we've been online, I've found out from students that they've been talking to their cousins, they've been talking to their coworkers, and that's encouraged, right? You should try to get more points of view so that you're not kind of stuck in your own box. Um, so basically, I need to see whether you're making these connections. I didn't give you these things on accident, right? These are designed to try to provoke a method so that you can take these things and put them together, right? So not very many of you were able to do that in the midterm. So I'm hoping that I can explain that throughout this short presentation. Um, the main thing that in my 10 years of teaching this class, what Kingsborough students struggle with in ways that other students at other schools that I've taught at don't struggle with is this idea of relational power. So most of you are looking at power as an object that you go to the store and you pick up. I'm gonna, again, from my years of teaching with you, I'm gonna assume this has something to do. A lot of you have the answer of money, right? So it's obviously true that you can get money, right? Money is in the way you're using that phrase, an object, right? Um, I'm not going to go into the fiction of that object and how it's dead. We do that in class. Um, but nonetheless, right, it's certainly true that if you had a little bit more money, then you'd be able to do this or that, right? Let's say you wanted to impress somebody you're trying to date. You might not need money, but you might think that you do. So you go out and you get some, you go work, you get some money, and then you buy something hoping it's going to impress that person. That's not quite the same thing as power. And so I think, the big problem here is that when you start extending your idea of money as an object to power as an object, there's lots of problems with that. So the basic one would be if money is, how you get power, then how come Elon Musk has so little power? Same thing with Bill Gates. They have power only within their little spheres, right? Because of the roles that they play, and that's what we're going to get into. So power always comes in relations, right? It's not something that you go and you grab and you take with you from place to place. Now, I know that most of you have been thinking this for a long time, so I'm not expecting you to suddenly change your mind. So that's kind of the goal of this class. By the end of this semester, you'd start to see power as relational, because that's what constitutional law is all about. So I need you to see constitutional law as a system, right? A lot of you are seeing it as an ideal, and it could be seen as an ideal, could be interpreted as an ideal, but ideals are not, objects either, right? They're things, they're language, they're ideas, and so you need to start seeing the system of constitutional law, which comes down to three concepts that have pieces within them. There's the institution of law, the ideologies of law, and the instrumentalities of law. So the institutions of law are probably the easiest. Those are the rules and the norms that you've kind of come to know over the years. And those take place, in a variety of settings. They take place in Congress, they take place in courthouses, but they also take place in the street. They take place in schools, they take place in hospitals, right? Even little kids make up rules. So that's what we want to think about how is law part of an institution, right? Institutions are things that we create in order to, I guess, better understand each other is probably the ultimate goal. But to kind of keep things stable and predictable is how most people view it. The instrumentalities are like lawsuits, but they can also be threats, right? They can be contracts, they can be wills. There's a lot of different pieces that people use within the law. So you can start to think about those as tools in the same way, if you were building a house, you'd have to go get a bunch of tools, right? And then the third thing is probably the hardest, because many of you are kind of in the middle of the ideology. So you might have thought there's only one ideology. I'm going to show you here there's several ideologies, probably dozens. But this is how we think about law, or what we think law is. So most of you are thinking law is an object. That's the ideology. That's the idea of law that you are carrying around with you. That's not how everybody sees law, and that's certainly not how judges or lawyers see law, and it's not how the constitutional framers saw law. So this is the big shift I'm trying to make. You have this kind of idea, and now we're trying to deepen your understanding so that you can improve your grade for the paper and the exam, and if you want to do extra credit, of course, right? So I put over here on the left-hand side, here's the question that I asked you. And if you get to take Dr. Chapman, who's a very funny person and a good teacher, he'll often say, after a student gives a response, that's a great answer, but it's not the answer to the question I asked. So I'm going to break down the question I asked and try to show you what it means. So most of you failed in this regard. A few of you got this, but I want to know how you think, right? I don't want you to copy and paste something. A couple of you actually literally copied and paste things from the internet. I'm looking to see if you're capable of theorizing, of analyzing. Can you take the information that you've gained so far and construct a theory? Can you construct a model, right? Can you predict how behavior will occur in the future? That's what we do in social science. I don't need you to simply describe things that you found on the internet. Now, what am I asking you to think about? I'm asking you to think about or theorize about social groups. Most of you are having a very hard time with that, so I'm going to make this really clear. There's the dominant social group, the majority population, which is, as many of you know, right, white as a culture, right, white culture, but also, lighter skinned folks in America. That's how we define a social group within this constitutional structure, as many of you have highlighted. If I go to a different country, right, if I go to China, then it's a different situation. If I go to Mexico, it's a different situation. There's skin shade discrimination all over the world, but here we're not just talking about that. We're talking about the culture, right? So how do the stories that social groups tell? I could, Justice Sotomayor famously talks about going to law school, and somebody was talking about Alice in Wonderland, and she'd never read the book, and all the white people were shocked that she'd never read the book. Now, she could say, in my culture, I read all these things. Did you read these things, right? And they'd say no. So why does the majority or the dominant culture believe that everyone else is going to know all these ideals? So how do they define deviant behavior? Well, they define deviant behavior as simply being a minority. So the fact that you're a minority means you're already a deviant in their point of view. So you're going to have to assimilate or show that you fit in, right? And that's not always possible for all people, but even probably more often, people don't know that, especially when they first come to the country, or if they're a young person, right? If you're 8 or 9 years old, how could you know that? Now, that's part of it, right? But it's about how to maintain control over those social groups. So how does the dominant group maintain control? And we're talking about actions here, not intent. We're not talking about why they're doing it. We're not talking about whether they're racist. We're not talking about whether they're bad. What we're talking about is what are the processes? What are the actions that they take, right? So if you watch a simple TV show, I'll give you an example that I saw. That I was a TV show I've watched a bunch of times. I won't tell you the TV show, but the scene goes like this: a white mother is explaining to her father-in-law that she needs to leave this quote-unquote bad neighborhood. So immediately we're not thinking about bad, right, in the sense of evil humans. We're thinking, what, rundown, dangerous, right? These things that are structural. They're about the actions of other humans. Now, the ideology of the dominant group is, let you finish the sentence, right? And so what do I see in the next scene immediately? As the older gentleman, the father-in-law, is driving through the neighborhood, we see in the TV screen an elderly black woman coming out to get her paper, right? And immediately he then goes and says, yeah, it's time to get you out of this neighborhood. That's not subtle, right? That's an action, right? That they're showing you what they want the relationship to be within this dominant ideology. In other words, that's the kind of place she should live, but that's not the kind of place that the young white woman should live, right? She should live in this ideal of like the American dream, blah, blah, blah. So this is kind of, what we're looking at. We're not looking at the intent. And I have no idea. Like, did the writers of the show intend to do this? It doesn't really matter, right? Because they did do it, right? They did make that action. And I would argue that even if they didn't know, this is so deeply ingrained into the majority or the dominant point of view that it was just an easy tool for them to use in this TV show. And you could look at advertising, you could look at TV shows, all these things, movies that I'm talking about. And I grant you, it's harder to see in Brooklyn, New York, because there's so much diversity. But once you kind of get out of that, then you need to start thinking about social groups as a larger structure than just what you see in your neighborhood. So that's also a good time to then we're talking about keeping the power relationship. So how is it that white folks who live in Connecticut maintain their power over minority groups even though they don't live in New York City? Or you could think about, how do politicians in Manhattan maintain their control over the social groups in Brooklyn, even though Brooklyn is a majority diverse borough. So it's about how do they keep those relationships. So if you're really into this and you want to learn more, this is called hegemony, Hegemony. And this is about how does the dominant group tell stories in such a way that the minority group doesn't even question their submissiveness, their unequal power relationship. But as you've seen in Black Lives Matters and other movements, the equal pay movement, immigration movement, the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, for an example, right? The Women's March, Me Too movement. These are threats to the power, right? They're trying to shift the power so that they have equal power in these relationships. So how does the dominant group maintain their power in midst of these these power shifts, right? So how do they respond? And most of you know the answer. They mostly use the police, right? They mostly use law enforcement, surveillance, things like that. And then this is obviously now looking at the other side, right? Once the minority starts to get awareness of their injustice, they don't want to be labeled. They don't want to be controlled. They don't want to be dominated. So this is now reveals to us, this shows us, right, like by looking at these power relationships, that there's a system of social control here. And that anytime you have power that is dominant and, based in social control, then you're going to have resistance. So here's some things you need to think about, right? A lot of you are going to be questioning this, and that's fine. These are well understood concepts within social science. And this is something that you're going to have to practice at and understand. These aren't accidental, right? These inequities aren't accidental. Injustice is not particular. It's not based on one individual's intent or motive. It's a system, right? So there's benefits and costs to going against the system. If you want to think about this in the Black Lives Matter movement, you think about the blue line or blue lives matter, right? This is trying to say that there's only a few bad apples, but this misses the point entirely, right? If you just think about it from quotas, for example, in New York City, that means there's going to be more tense negative encounters with young black men. And police officers, right? So again, we're not talking there about the individual race or identity or ethnicity of the police officer and the person being stopped or suspected of deviance. What we're talking about is a system that encourages benefits by stopping people based on these prejudices, based on these systemic inequities. So again, it's not blaming individuals, it's looking at the whole system. And that's what you need to think about. And remember, the Constitution of the United States is designed to maintain power over slaves, over enslaved people, and over women. So as Dr. Chapman also says, the system is working exactly how it's intended. So you want to think about resistance in this, but you also want to think about power always comes in the form of roles. So law then is a tool to maintain or change these power relationships. I'm going to say that again. Law is a tool to either maintain or change these power relationships through those three methods I told you: institutional, instrumental, and ideological. But you must understand the system first. So this is tough, and this is something that many of the professors in the criminal justice program are talking about, is how do we try to increase your knowledge that you were largely supposed to get in high school and in introductory classes like sociology and American government. You need to understand the pieces of the system and how they work together. So far, I'm going to show you in the next slide, too many of your concepts are disconnected, right? They're standing alone as individual concepts. So I'm going to try to bring these together so that you have some way of making sense of this. It's useful to start with power relationships of parent and child, right? Now, certainly an infant needs that power relationship. They need the parent to be dominant over them. However, as the child grows up or as the parent's behavior changes, there needs to be some resistance there. The child needs to resist the parent's desire to dominate. And you can see this in a number of situations. But at some point, obviously, you have to challenge that notion. If you're a 50-year-old male with 80-year-old parents, you need to be an independent person in America, right? So that power dominant position has to shift at some point. For most kids, it starts around 8, right? And you start to see the exhibitionism in America of kids proclaiming their individuality. But you can see all sorts of situations where it would have to happen before or after. But remember, you get costs and benefits for going against that, right? Largely, parents who are paying for their children all the way through college, let's say, for example, are maintaining that power over their children through those means. Now, the cop and the suspected deviant is a little bit different, right? Because the cop doesn't have a natural relationship, but they have this, by wearing a costume, right? They have this perceived authority, right? And this is why I think people want to get to the individual motives of police when there's something that goes wrong. But again, I'm not saying costume to be funny. I'm saying it to take out the ideology, right? We say uniform and somehow it makes it more important. And they do this in lots of situations, right? The dominant group, they give police officers uniforms, aka costumes. They give judges costumes, right? In some ways, you could even say professors have a costume, right? At least I think I do. I try to. I mean, in this environment, we can't see it, but and students are supposed to have a costume, and deviants are supposed to have a costume. If you watch, TV. Same thing with children, right? They're supposed to dress a certain way. This is all because these are roles, right? These are roles that we've created. They're not natural roles. Somebody isn't born a cop. Somebody isn't born a teacher, right? And so this is where you need to start thinking about what are the costs and benefits of going along with these roles. Obviously, the suspected deviant has to weigh those costs and benefits very carefully because the cop has a gun. But in the teacher-student relationship, the main power I have over you, right, is the grade. And in some ways, that can be just as devastating as being shot at. Now, probably not as devastating as being shot, but you see kind of the dilemma here. So instead of looking at power as an object, you need to start thinking about them in relationships. That's really the thing I'm going to focus on in grading you in your papers and in your final exam. So what you need to be focusing on, thinking about, theorizing, critical analysis is when and how does power shift in these relationships and under what conditions. Now, again, I collected all of your ideas as a unit, right, from both classes. So there's 60 students, and in your early responses, these are all the major concepts that you're bringing out as you define justice. and you defined the Justice Academy, right? And so this is problematic because all of these things are so disconnected. But notice what you see in the middle, right? You've got power, you've got equality, right? These are constructed ideas. They're not real, right? They're not objects. It's not a hammer. It's not a nail, right? It's not a gun. But we believe they mean certain things. They only mean certain things in connection with one another, though. And that's what we're really struggling to do in this class. So let's take a reality check for a second. At this point in the semester, I'd more or less encourage you or force you to now talk to one another because you'd start to have to confront your ideologies, right? The ideas that you came into the classroom with that are so wildly different than mine as a lawyer, right, and a scholar. And so I have to start getting you to see where you're, it's not about being right or wrong, right? It's about having an ill-formed idea and then getting a little bit better at forming these connections. So, the big problem I saw, in the midterm is none of you, zero of you, quoted directly to the case. I'm going to hope and believe and be optimistic that you read the case and you didn't just Google the case and get what somebody else had to say about it. It's a basic college skill to be able to read something and pull out a couple, 2, 3, 4 important quotes. The fact that none of you did that worries me, right? Because it means that maybe you're not learning how to do that in another class. So I need to think about this a bit and think about maybe you just didn't think it was important, or maybe I don't want to blame you, right? But maybe you just thought that this wasn't part of the assignment. So now I'm making it clear that, from now on, you need to quote directly to the cases. So when I ask you what's the holding of the case, I'm not asking you to go to Google and tell me what, the internet says it is. I'm asking you to read the case and pull out a quote that the judge wrote down that you think is important. This shows me that you're thinking. This shows me that you're theorizing. And most often it will not be what you found on the internet. In fact, those answers, by and large, were nonsense. So, this is a really bad habit. It's also plagiarism. And so, this is a tough thing that administrators are trying to figure out all over the country. It's so easy for you to steal other people's work on the internet and use it as your own, to the point where you might not even be realizing that you're doing that. It's against the law. And it also can get you kicked out of college. Now, I'm not going to do that to you because I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and try to focus on this basic comprehension skill that you need to be developing. So here's the good habit. A lot of you are struggling. And I know that sounds weird, but it's good for you to struggle. A lot of you are trying to make these connections. And it seems like the maps really, really were the place where you were starting to make connections a lot better. So I need you to go back into those readings and struggle to read through them and try to pull out what's 1 or 2 sentences. Now, a couple of you did do this, and I see that as good, right? I see that as a good process. This is what this class is about, and legal studies are very difficult. This is not, it is not an easy kind of thing to do. The better habit would be to ask questions, and this kind of breaks my heart that more students don't do this. In the classroom, it obviously happens a lot. But this online environment, for whatever reason, students just aren't asking very many questions about the content. It's something I have to think about more and talk to other educators. But you really should getting into this habit of asking questions, especially when you don't understand the content. So what I'm going to do as an experiment is open up the discussion board, give you extra credit for thoughtful responses, but start talking to each other in the same way that you'd be talking to each other in the classroom. Right? Start saying what you think about these readings, and let's see, right? Nobody's going to get these right away. I've been studying these concepts for a very long time, and it's always interesting to get unique perspectives, especially from students, because you're starting out with a very fresh, kind of curious mind. And so you might see things that have been overlooked. So this is the time to take risks. I'm not going to grade you down for misunderstanding a quote from a case. I'm going to grade you down for not using a quote from a case. So I hope that I've made that kind of clear. Now, the next thing is much harder. And so I want to be patient with you and have you, work on this. And I'm going to give you a couple suggestions. We're talking here about synthesizing. You're going to take the things that I've given you as reading materials and as course materials, And what you should be doing is you should have a main point and a purpose for each of those, right? What is that thing trying to say? One or two sentences. And you should put that in a table, and so you can start to see, compare and contrast those ideas. How are the maps similar to the revolution videos? And, how do those compare to the Constitution and cases? Now, a bunch of you, right, about 7 or 8 of you, did a great job of comparing the maps to the Constitution that you read. That's very promising. I'm going to go over some of the problems you had when reading those constitutions, but you left out the revolution videos and the cases. So the goal of that is that all 4 of those things really roughly are saying the same thing. But you're not picking that up, or at least you're not showing me that you understand that. Now, these are advanced college skills, so it takes time to be able to do this. You should be focusing on, once you get those similarities, you should be focusing on what are the differences. And as my favorite professor in law school, Natasha Martin, said, is it a difference that makes a difference? So I'll give one comparison that a few of you got, which I think is very insightful. Is that when you looked at the maps, you saw that the west coast of Africa and the east coast of the United States, and I think hopefully you'd also see that the coast in the Caribbean were where these slave trade markets were, right? This is the largest place for these things. I would hope, right, that you would start to think a little bit about and say, okay, think about shopping centers in Brooklyn, right? They're not scattered. They're in very central areas. So why is that? What is it about the geography that brings those different people into those places? So a few of you were able to then kind of start to make the connections that it was easy to kidnap people and then force them to kidnap other people right there on the coast. It became harder the further inland you went. It was easier to sell slaves right on the coast. The farther inland you go, the harder it is to do that. So there's an economic ease thing going on. Now, some of you got confused about all of this and you're still trying to put intent onto people. But again, what are the benefits from participating in the slave trade? And if you're thinking like, oh, I never would have done that, there's things you can look up on the internet to show that you are benefiting from the slave trade that still exists today. You're also benefiting from the prison industrial complex system that produces, cotton and whatnot. So, and we all do, right? Because what would be the costs of going against that system? You see people trying to go against it, and there's severe social consequences for it. That's not a reason not to do it, but I'm just showing you that why most people just kind of go along with evil things, right? Many of you called this system evil. So you want to think about like, what are the differences now versus then? Well, now more people are participating in the system. There's more money to be made, and slavery has expanded beyond just enslaving Africans, right? Now the number one group are actually young girls under the age of 16. So, you can kind of think about systems evolving over time, not going away, right? They don't go away, right? Unless people stop them. So you now need to think about, how does this explain norms and group cohesion, right? How do you probably, if you think about it deeply, if you thought slavery is evil, you probably know people who think slavery is evil. And then you develop your norms and your rules based on that principle, right? That you would never enslave another person. Abraham Lincoln also said that I would never be a slave, therefore I would never enslave anyone. That's a norm, right? And that forms a group so that people get along. But remember, there's other groups that say, no, I'm superior to, these people, so therefore I'm going to enslave them. Well, that establishes the rules and the norms of that social group, right? And you could do that on and on and on. There's lots of different ways of thinking about that. But always think about this. There's also intra-group conflict, right? Think about a norm that your family has that you don't agree with, and that that creates conflicts, right? So that's one of those places where you can push and see the relationship of minority majority starting to shift. In really broad terms, if you thought about it in the Black Lives Matter movement, the white folks such as myself, right, that are resisting white supremacy and these myths, are causing conflict within the so-called white cultural community, and that's what allows for change to occur. So now this leads to resolution and justice through these processes. So I'm going to let that sink in, but again, my recommendation then is to make a table, pull out these main points so that you can see them and you're not just trying to pull them from the back of your brain. Now, some major problems that I saw is that most of you were looking at these comparative constitutions through the American point of view. So you saw, the fact that Russia writes down a right as a very great thing, without doing, I guess, further research to find out that that is rarely, tolerated, right? So dissent is not tolerated, as the most recent arrest, of the opposition leader. So, I hope that, this is not what my intent was. I was hoping that you'd actually see the differences between the systems. But most of you have tried to look for similarities, and I'll have to think more about that. So these systems are very different, right? So South Africa has a constitution that's built as a response to slavery and segregation. And so after that revolution occurred, they have a what you might call a pro-rights constitution. Russia has a cultural constitution, one that is there to preserve a cultural balance that is historic in that nation. China has a political constitution. It's all about maintaining power at the centralized point of view. The EU constitution, if I could be so bold, is a mess. It's what happens when you get 20 plus nations, all with their own constitutions, trying to come together, and was very much tried to repeat what the United States did. And there's all sorts of research you could do as to why that hasn't worked out quite as well. But you could even see Brexit as kind of its own southern, separationist kind of movement. And then Uzbekistan is an interesting constitution from my point of view, from talking to students, because of the experience of capitalism, socialism, and communism, trying to now work that economic constitution out. So, there's always going to be similarities because we're all humans, right? But you need to start focusing on the differences that result in different political systems and different power relationships. So, what's really going on here from my point of view as an educator is that most of you are describing, you're not analyzing. I'm sure this works in other classes, and it might even be, one of the learning outcomes, but that's not a learning outcome in an advanced class like this. The expectation is that by this point now, you're able to analyze and think deeply. So I don't need you to describe the things that you're able to see. I need you to think deeply and tell me what the difference is between different parts of the system. And then most of you, of course, are struggling to get past your initial ideas. I'm telling you that just to remind you that this is your real challenge, is that you have to try to move beyond what you brought into the classroom. It's not about changing your point of view. I don't care if you're a Republican, a Democrat, a liberal, a conservative, or however you define yourself. In fact, I encourage you to go deeper into your political ideology. But what we're doing here is not about linking what you believe with proof of your belief, right? That's a very religious concept. What I'm trying to get you to do is see that some of your beliefs are a little ill-formed, right? So if you thought about it as like, taking a class where you're starting to learn about gravity, you hadn't thought about gravity. So you only had certain assumptions about it. But as you learn more about it, you're going to start to hear a bunch of stuff that you never knew existed, right? Like thermodynamics. All of a sudden you're like, well, what does that have to do with gravity? And so it's going to take you a little while to try to make those connections. So in the last two slides, I have some suggestions. I would start with just take a big piece of paper, just like a little kid does, and just start mapping out all these different concepts, right? Just like I did in the previous slide, right? Those were all of your concepts. Most of you have 5 or 6. Some of them are the ones you came in with. Some are new ones, and you want to see like, how are you evolving? How are you changing your knowledge process? And, make these like thought bubbles or something that's going to help you remember that this is what I think, right? And this is where I'm trying to get. So I thought power was an object. Now I'm trying to see how power is relational. I'm going to start looking at relationships. Focus on the differences, not the similarities. You got to start looking for differences, like teaching your brain to start looking for something new, as opposed to looking for what always looks, similar to what you already knew. Try to think deeply about the cause, right? Cause. And I'm going to get to that more in the next slide. But between the written ideals, right, what we want things to be, we want things to be free, equal, justice, right? But then how people live in justice, right? So it can't be just because there's a rule that everybody's going to follow the rule. Maybe the rule wasn't very well written. Maybe the rule is based on a majority point of view that doesn't really apply to the minority. Maybe the rule is a lie. Maybe it's it's there just to try and confuse people. These are not going to be simple causal mechanisms, and they're not going to be psychological. that doesn't mean that there's no psychology involved. Of course there is, but your psychology does not come before the environment, right? It's a relational thing. So obviously you're seeing a theme here. And then try to use the discussion board to really pull out these different points of view, and challenge these kind of overgeneralizations, these simple answers. If life was this simple, we wouldn't even need to go to school. So finally, I tried to make a diagram here to help you, for those of you who are visual, and I would have done this in class, right? We'd go over this and I'd have lines everywhere. But again, you want to think about, there's a system of inequity in the United States. It's not accidental. It was designed to be unequal. And a basic reading of the Constitution shows you this, or a basic history class. But what you need to understand is, the dominant group, it starts off with white supremacy, and white supremacy is not, sometimes students get confused, right? This is not, bad intent. This is the idea that lots of white people just walk around with without ever thinking that their culture is supreme, that it's superior, that they believe that they're better than people. Some people call it American exceptionalism. This also is very tightly tied to elitism, right? That you're only important if you operate a certain position in society, right? And that's clearly just devastatingly wrong. Then there's the myth of meritocracy. If you simply just work hard, then you'll get to be one of these elites. Considering that elites make up less than 5% of the population, there's something dreadfully wrong with the theory of meritocracy. Individualism is also another dangerous idea that promotes the idea that it almost only applies to white males of a certain age. But it says that somehow that you've constituted yourself, that you made yourself. You're a self-made person. Basic biology would help you understand that that's nonsense, right? At the very least, you have your mom and dad that actually made you. A belief in religion would help you, untangle that individualism. I'm sure individualism has its merits, like say in Greek tragedies, it's a very interesting character, right? In those stories, superhero movies, right? Individualism is great, but those are movies, those are fiction, that's not reality. And then what you need to understand is this is all based in constitutional roles, right? So power has been given, right? Authority has been given, influence and dominance have been given to white males through these constructed positions within the Constitution. So then, these orange pieces are, as I explained, how law works in those three functions, right? So there's the institutions are the legal norms, the rules, and exceptions that white people make mostly for themselves. As you saw, Donald Trump came into office and said, he's going to ban people from lobbying and then working in the government and vice versa. So he just undid that right before he left, right? So he makes an exception for his own people that he doesn't want, to apply to everybody. And that's pretty common with most leaders within business, etc. Now, the legal ideology is that there are rights and that these are negative rights. In other words, they become active when somebody does something against your rights. It's a myth, right? It's an ideology that's improper because it's not real. What's really going on is that especially white males of privilege, elite white males, they know the norms, they know the rules, and they know the exceptions. And they don't go around telling everybody those rules, norms, and exceptions. That's partially what I'm trying to do in this class, is let you know what the structure of the law is so that you know these rules as well. So it's kind of like playing a game with somebody and they tell you you're breaking the rules so you lose the game, right? So you couldn't learn the rules until somebody taught you the rules. Now, how do they maintain this structure? Obviously through the threat of violence or the use of violence, which is police, corrections, but more and more surveillance. And now with kind of COVID and electronic surveillance and all of this, it's becoming more and more used instead of police, right? Because police, as you're seeing, are somewhat unreliable as humans, right? It'd be much easier to use robots in the future who don't ask questions, who don't make judgments, who don't have discretion. But again, the police obviously work for the dominant group. They don't represent the minorities, and they certainly don't represent everybody. That's a lovely ideal, but it's not reality. So then, on the other hand, right, you have the minority groups, and we know that they're minority groups through the injustices, right? We see this pattern of injustices of dominant white folks who are violating their privileges, they're abusing their authority, they're abusing their influence, domination, and power. So how do we see this add up? Well, this is where it gets interesting. One student wrote, like, most people don't want to be controlled. it seems that that should be logic, that should be common sense. But then why are so many people submissive to control? Well, one argument that has been made in a theory that's been around for quite a while, over 100 years, is that minorities must believe in the ideal. They must believe in these legal norms, rules, and exceptions, even though they're benefiting white males to the exclusion of minorities. That is one explanation, right? Because otherwise, why would minorities continue to believe in these rules that don't benefit them? The other problem with this, right, is that the ideology and the rights as negative already identify somebody as deviant, right? So they're saying like, well, you're deviant because you're poor. You're deviant because you're black. You're deviant because you're a woman who wears a nose ring, right? And so the rules and the belief in those rules then work together to maintain that not just power of dominance, but the system of belief, right? Where you'd start to feel crazy if you said, wait a second, these rules don't seem to be working for me. And then this is what controls the social relations, because the second you start to step out of line, in comes the police, in comes corrections, in comes surveillance, right? And surveillance now is, so much it's in schools, it's in hospitals, right? Again, that you start to question yourself, and obviously the costs really start to increase if you want to try to go against the dominant culture. So here are the things that you need to remember, right? This is what a junior at John Jay would understand after taking these classes. To understand causal mechanisms, right? The cause of some occurrences over time, right? Not one situation, but the repeated injustice, let's say, of black folks in America for 400 years. It's not coincidental, right? It's a system. So the Constitution creates those roles of power relations, and it created the power of the majority over the minority. Now, let's think about something together, right? The majority population is still about 80% white folks in America across the country. But in Brooklyn, for example, white people are not the majority. In other parts of the country, white folks aren't the majority. And there's projections that in about 30, 40 years, white folks will not be the majority more. Now, that's hard to know, right? You're talking about birth rates, death rates, all these other things, immigration. But let's say that it's switched. Well, then you'd suddenly see, right, a different set, in theory, you'd see a different set of values, norms, beliefs, rules, exceptions, and people would have to start negotiating. So that's where those power relations would start to shift. So white folks in America keep their power in those areas because they have the majority population and because they represent, look at the Senate, for example, they represent majority positions in these elite positions. That's why they kind of like elitism, right? Because that reinforces their power. So legal cases, create a pattern of legal reasoning using the majority logic of the norms, right? So since like the 1930s, for example, judges have been using economic interpretation of stability and predictability. They didn't really use that prior to the 30s. So this became a way of controlling the economy as another way of influencing the legal norms and maintaining social control. So, this is how judges kind of, they're not separate from this system, and they tend to be white males as well. And you don't have to be a white male to believe in white male ideology, right? And I'm sure you all know what I mean. So this is just a pattern that then judges pull back on, and this is what kind of keeps the law, consistent in the form. Now, it also creates, however, a space for resistance, right? Because if you say, for example, in a legal case that we're all free and equal, well, now I can use that, right? I can use that legal case to say, well, I'm not being treated free and equally. Therefore, it's a contradiction. And that's largely what we're studying in this class, are these contradictions and how they resolve. Now, minorities experience injustice because of the system, not because of individual bad behaviors, right? Bad behaviors of the actors within the system are based on the fact that they get benefits for those bad behaviors. If we increase the costs of those bad behaviors, which means we'd have to change all those things in the orange, then obviously they would behave differently. This also, have to start thinking about, quote unquote, what about the good cops, right? That's something interesting to study, right? What about those cops that are taking risks, that are taking costs, at going against the other blue lives and saying like, no, these systems are wrong. What is causing them, right? What's their kind of belief system to think about resistance that way? And then the system is designed to maintain social control over minorities on behalf of the majority. Now, that doesn't have to be that way, right? You could have a system designed to maintain control of a minority of monks or clerics or priests, right? Or rabbis, right? Or you could have a system designed to maintain social control by women over men, right? There's lots of different ways you can organize this, but the system in the United States is obviously, and through much empirical research, has been proven to be, and is radically common sense, the majority population of white folks and their cultural values over that of minorities. And this is where you get things like you need to learn English, right? All these different things. Now, certainly you do if you want to be a part of this system, but you don't have to be a part of the system. And certainly, if you believe in human rights or you believe in law as an ideal, then you can see the failure of both of those. So it's a lot to think about. I think you should watch this more than once. And I really, please take me up on the offer to ask good questions about the content and to start trying to see this in a systemic way. Most of the videos that I offer you in the second half are trying to help you get further into this. And so I use a lot of examples from student work in the past so that you can kind of see where you are at in that process.